Moscow is not burning. That would be too simple. What is burning is something far more dangerous to the Kremlin than any building: the illusion that the heart of Russia's strategic command machinery was untouchable. At $50 billion of accumulated investment, decades of Soviet-era hardening, fiber optic backbone, redundant power grids, and the political mythology of a fortress capital, the strategic command architecture that Vladimir Putin built to run this war was supposed to be the one thing Ukraine could never reach. As I record this, that assumption is finished, not damaged. Finished. Ukraine did not just hit a node. Ukraine demonstrated that the entire concept of a protected Russian strategic rear has collapsed, and the command center Putin counted on to coordinate this war, the integrated network of bunkers, relay stations, hardened communications hubs, and bomber dispersal fields that together form Moscow's central nervous system for the Ukrainian theater, has been broken in a way that cannot be reconstituted at any price, on any timeline, in any politically survivable form. Let me be precise, because precision is the difference between commentary and analysis. This is not a story about one building. This is a story about a strategic command system whose physical, doctrinal, and psychological foundations have been dismantled in stages, and the final stage just happened. What you are about to hear is not a tactical update. It is a case study in why Russia's entire theory of strategic depth was always going to fail against an opponent that learned faster than the empire could adapt. Pull the lens back. The real question is not whether one command site is gone. The real question is whether Putin still possesses a survivable strategic command architecture at all. And the answer, after everything that has happened from June 2025 through this month, is no. Now rewind with me. Go back to early 2022. Russian strategic doctrine rested on a premise so deeply embedded that nobody inside the general staff thought to question it. The premise was geography. The premise was distance. The premise was that Ukraine, even with Western weapons, could not reach the strategic core. Bombers parked at Olenia, more than 1,800 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Bombers parked at Belaya in Irkutsk Oblast, more than 4,000 kilometers from Kiev. Command and communications relay infrastructure dispersed across Engels, Diaghilevo, Ivanovo, and the deep Moscow exurbs. The National Defense Management Center on Frunzenskaya Embankment, an enormous concrete and steel structure designed in the Shoigu era as the integrated supreme command node for the entire Russian armed forces, sitting inside the most heavily defended airspace in the Russian Federation. And surrounding all of this, a layered air defense architecture, S-400 batteries, Pantsir close-in systems, electronic warfare units, the supposedly impenetrable Moscow Air Defense District. On paper, it looked overwhelming. On the actual battlefield, that assumption failed. And let that sink in for a moment, because this is the operational truth the Kremlin spent 2 years trying to deny. The Russian theory of strategic depth was never a fact. It was a hope. The first crack appeared in 2023. Ukrainian drones reached Moscow. They were small. They did limited damage. The Kremlin dismissed them as nuisance strikes, the work of dissidents, exaggerated propaganda. That dismissal was the second mistake, and it was not tactical. It was psychological. Because when an authoritarian system tells itself a strike was symbolic rather than structural, it stops investing in the kind of hardened, distributed, survivable command architecture that modern warfare actually requires. Russia spent 2023 and 2024 pretending the threat was marginal. Ukraine spent the same years building the industrial base, the long-range drone fleet, the human intelligence networks, and the operational doctrine that would turn marginal strikes into strategic ones. And it gets even more serious from here. By the autumn of 2024, the Ukrainian long-range strike program had matured into something the Russian General Staff still refused to call by its real name. It was no longer a harassment campaign. It was a deliberate sequence, doctrinally coherent dismantling of Russian strategic infrastructure. Oil refineries at Ryazan, Volgograd, Tuapse, ammunition depots at Toropets and Tikhoretsk that produce fireballs visible from satellites, strategic radar stations in Armavir and Orsk. And then, on the 1st of June 2025, the operation that broke the back of the Russian strategic bomber force and exposed the entire myth of Russian rear area sanctuary, Operation Spiderweb. Now, I want you to listen carefully because what happened on June 1st, 2025 is the doctrinal foundation of everything that has happened since, including the strike we are discussing tonight. Operation Spiderweb was not a drone raid. It was a strategic decapitation rehearsal. The security service of Ukraine smuggled 117 first-person view drones inside wooden cabins mounted on commercial trucks, driven deep into Russian territory by unwitting Russian drivers. Those cabins opened by remote command across 5 time zones, and the drones launched against 4 strategic air bases simultaneously: Olenya in Murmansk Oblast, Belaya in Irkutsk, Diaghilevo in Ryazan, and Ivanovo. Ukrainian intelligence claimed 41 aircraft hit. Independent visual confirmation supported the destruction of at least 7 Tu-95 MS strategic bombers and 4 Tu-22M3 long-range bombers, with damage to additional airframes, including a rare A-50 airborne early warning aircraft. German military intelligence assessed that roughly 10% of Russia's strategic bomber fleet was damaged or destroyed in a single coordinated operation. Ukrainian estimates of $7 billion in damage were disputed by Moscow, but the irreplaceability of those airframes is not disputed by anyone serious. The Tu-95 production line closed in 1992. The Tu-22M3 production line closed in 1993. These aircraft cannot be rebuilt. They can only be lost. That is the doctrinal anchor. Hold it in your mind, because everything that has come after is the same logic compounding. After Spiderweb, Russia did exactly what the Ukrainian planners predicted Russia would do. It scattered. It dispersed surviving bombers to Anadyr in the Russian Far East, to Ukrainka, to fields where the runway infrastructure was never designed for sustained heavy bomber operations. It tried to harden parking aprons with concrete revetments. It painted tire silhouettes on tarmacs to confuse satellite analysts. It moved command and control further from the front, deeper into the supposed sanctuary of Moscow's air defense umbrella. And that movement, that retreat into the supposedly safest interior, is the trap Ukraine has been walking Russia into for the last 12 months. Because once you have concentrated your residual strategic command capacity into a smaller number of nodes, the doctrinal calculus reverses. The fewer nodes you have, the more catastrophic the loss of any single one becomes. Russia compressed its strategic command architecture into a smaller footprint, believing concentration meant protection. What concentration actually meant was that one decisive strike could remove a disproportionate share of the surviving capability. This matters enormously, because what is being called Moscow's last $50 billion strategic command center is not a single building. It is the integrated remainder of a system Russia spent the post-Spiderweb year trying to rebuild, a consolidated nexus of communications relays, hardened bunker infrastructure, signals routing, bomber coordination authority, and the data fusion architecture that ties strategic aviation, missile forces, and the general staff into a single operational picture. When I say $50 billion, I am not pricing the concrete. I am pricing the entire capital stock of Soviet-era and post-Soviet command investment that flows through that nexus: fiber optic trunk lines, satellite uplink terminals, redundant power, the engineering core that maintains it, the air defense regiments that protect it, and the decades of institutional knowledge embedded in its operating procedures. And the Ukrainian campaign of the last 6 months, culminating in the May 2026 strike series we have been watching unfold, has shattered that nexus. Walk with me through what this actually means at the strategic level. In early May 2026, Ukrainian forces executed precision strikes against military and defense facilities inside Moscow Oblast, including microchip production tied directly to Russian-guided weapons manufacture and command infrastructure tied to long-range operations. On May 17th, Ukrainian drones struck defense and oil facilities in Moscow Oblast in a coordinated wave that breached the supposedly impenetrable air defense district around the capital. On May 21st, Ukrainian long-range systems hit a Russian drone pilot training academy in Snizhne, killing at least 65 cadets and an instructor, gutting the human pipeline that feeds Russia's own long-range strike program. And throughout late April and into May, the Ukrainian General Staff confirmed strikes on the Sverdlov munitions plant in Dzerzhinsk, on FAB bomb production facilities, on FSB nodes in occupied Kherson, on arsenals that feed the Russian Theater Command. Each of these strikes taken alone is a tactical event. Taken together, they are the systematic amputation of the command and supply nervous system that Moscow's strategic center exists to coordinate. And when the final hardened node is broken, when when the air defenses that were supposed to make Moscow's command district untouchable are revealed as porous, the entire structure loses its operational meaning. A command center that cannot survive cannot command. A communications hub that has been struck even once cannot be trusted again. The psychological damage exceeds the physical damage by an order of magnitude, and it gets even more serious from here because the mainstream framing of this entire campaign misses the doctrinal point. Western news coverage treats each Ukrainian strike as a discrete event, a refinery here, a bomber there, a depot somewhere else. Russian state media frames each strike as a terrorist incident, isolated and inconsequential. Both framings are wrong. Both miss the hidden military variable. The hidden variable is not the drones. It is not the cruise missiles. It is not even the smuggling networks. The hidden variable is the operational tempo at which Ukraine can identify, prioritize, and strike Russian strategic targets, and that tempo has now exceeded Russia's reconstitution rate. Let me say that again because this is the doctrinal verdict that frames everything else. Ukraine destroys Russian strategic capacity faster than Russia can rebuild it. That is not a tactical fact. That is a war-deciding fact. Once the strike rate exceeds the reconstitution rate, the trend is irreversible. There is no engineering solution. There is no industrial surge. There is no diplomatic pause that can recover what has been lost because the loss is compounding faster than the recovery cycle can close. This is the moment to talk about industrial reality because the propaganda obscures it and the propaganda has to be cut away. Russia's strategic command infrastructure was built across 4 decades of Soviet defense spending, augmented by approximately 20 years of post-Soviet modernization investment under Shoigu and his successors. The Frunzenskaya command complex alone, completed in 2014, represented an enormous concentration of capital, hardened underground levels, integrated data centers, situational awareness theaters modeled on Cold War redundancy doctrine, and that is the hardened relay stations across Moscow Oblast, the buried fiber connecting them, the dispersed backup nodes, all of it required not just money, but specialized construction industries, military engineering regiments, and a domestic electronics base that in 2026 no longer exists in its pre-sanctions form. Russia cannot import the high-grade semiconductors that the original installations used. Russia cannot quickly train the specialist engineering cadre required to rebuild hardened command nodes. That cadre takes a decade to grow. Russia cannot, under wartime budgetary pressure, divert the cement, steel, copper, and electronics necessary to reconstitute a $50 billion capital stock when it is simultaneously losing tanks, drones, artillery barrels, and missile inventories at a rate the defense industry cannot match. Putin can issue the decree. The decree cannot manufacture the substrate. Pull the lens back even further. The Russian sovereign wealth, liquidity reserves, what is left of the national wealth fund's liquid portion, have been hemorrhaging through the war. Oil revenue is compressed by the price cap regime, by Ukrainian strikes on refineries that took out an estimated 15 to 20% of Russian refining capacity over the past year, and by the structural decline of European market access. The Russian budget for 2026 already runs a deficit larger than any in the Putin era. There's no $50 billion pool of free capital sitting in reserve to rebuild a strategic command nexus. Every ruble committed to reconstruction has to come out of something else, out of frontline supply, out of conscription bonuses, out of the social spending that holds the regime together, out of the bomber production lines that themselves cannot produce strategic aircraft anymore. This is the compound failure I have been describing for 2 years and that the mainstream coverage still refuses to name. Russia is not facing a budget problem. Russia is facing a strategic insolvency problem, and insolvent powers do not rebuild $50 billion command centers. They abandon them and pretend the abandonment was a strategic choice. This brings us to the climactic operation and to the doctrinal lesson that I want you to carry with you long after this analysis ends. The Ukrainian command's decision to systematically degrade Russia's consolidated post-spiderweb command architecture is the most important operational sequence of the 2026 campaign. Each strike in the May series was selected with surgical doctrinal precision. The microchip facility in Moscow Oblast was not chosen for its economic value. It was chosen because Russian-guided weapons cannot be produced at scale without it, which means every strike on it degrades the very long-range arm that the Strategic Command Center exists to coordinate. The Drone Pilot Academy in Snizhny was not chosen for its body count. It was chosen because it produces the operators who would have flown the Shahed derivative drones that the Strategic Command Center directs against Ukrainian cities. The Sverdlov munitions plant was not chosen because it is large. It was chosen because it produces the FAB glide bombs that the Strategic Aviation Force, the same force decimated at Spiderweb, uses to threaten Ukrainian positions in the absence of survivable cruise missile-bearing platforms. Every target removed degrades the operational meaning of the command center that would have directed those assets. And when the command center is finally rendered functionally inert, when its directives cannot be executed because the executing forces no longer exist, the building itself becomes a museum. That is what Ukraine has actually destroyed, not the concrete, the function. The $50 billion is gone because the value of a strategic command center is not the structure. The value is the network of effects it can produce. And that network is being amputated faster than Russia can grow it back. Putin can never replace it, not because he cannot pour concrete, but because the integrated industrial, electronic, human, and doctrinal substrate that gave the command center meaning has been systematically destroyed across 2 years of compounding Ukrainian strikes. You cannot rebuild a nervous system after every major nerve has been cut. You can rebuild the spinal column. You cannot rebuild what the spinal column used to connect. History will record this campaign as the moment the post-Cold War assumption about Russian strategic depth was finally and conclusively refuted. For 30 years, Western defense planners assumed that Russia's interior was a sanctuary, that the strategic command architecture inherited from the Soviet Union was modernized and survivable, that any future opponent who tried to reach into the Russian core would be deterred by air defenses, by distance, by nuclear escalation risk. Ukraine has demonstrated that all 4 assumptions were wrong. The interior is not a sanctuary. The modernization was shallow. The air defenses are penetrable by mass cheap drones and precision long-range systems. And the escalation threshold for striking strategic infrastructure has been crossed repeatedly without nuclear consequence, because the Kremlin's actual escalation calculus is far more constrained than the rhetoric ever admitted. The lesson is not that Russia is weak. The lesson is that Russia was never as strong as the architecture suggested, and that an opponent with adaptive doctrine, distributed industrial production, and the political will to strike strategic targets at scale can dismantle a great power command system from the outside. That is the broader pattern this confirms. Now hear me clearly on what comes next, because the forecast is the part most analysts get wrong. In the weeks ahead, Russia will attempt 3 things, and all 3 will fail. First, it will attempt to claim that the strategic command function has been redistributed to redundant nodes, to Chekhov, to Vlasica, to deeper bunkers in the Urals. Some redistribution has occurred, but redistribution without the integrated communications backbone is performative, not functional. Second, Russia will attempt a demonstrative strike against Ukrainian command infrastructure to restore the symmetry of risk. That strike, when it comes, will be massive in volume but not in strategic effect, because Ukrainian command and control has been distributed and hardened from the first month of the war, and there is no equivalent $50 billion Ukrainian node to destroy. Third, Russia will escalate rhetorically: nuclear signaling, mobilization talk, strategic exercise designed for Western television. None of that changes the underlying operational arithmetic. The strike rate exceeds the reconstitution rate. That equation cannot be reversed by speeches. The real strategic question, the one that will define the next phase of this war, is whether Ukraine's Western partners now understand what Ukraine has actually demonstrated and whether they will resource the campaign to its conclusion. Because the doctrinal proof of concept is complete. The remaining variable is industrial sustainment. If Ukraine receives the long-range systems, the targeting intelligence, the air defense to protect its own strike infrastructure, and the financial backing to sustain operational tempo through 2026 and into 2027, the dismantling of Russian strategic capability becomes irreversible at the regime survival level. If Western support falters, Russia gets a reconstitution window that no amount of valor can close from the Ukrainian side alone. That is the open question. That is the open loop. And that is the question that determines whether the strike I have analyzed tonight goes down in history as the decisive blow of the 2026 campaign, or as one more strike in a campaign that was abandoned before it could finish its work. I have spent decades watching how armies move, how command systems function, how empires fail when their assumptions outrun their adaptation. What we are witnessing right now is not a story about a building in Moscow. It is a case study in why the side that learns faster always wins the long war, and why the side that builds its doctrine on the protection of distance and hardened concrete always loses to the side that builds its doctrine on the destruction of distance and the irrelevance of concrete. The $50 billion strategic command center is gone in the only sense that matters, gone as a functional instrument of Russian war-making. Putin can never replace it because what was destroyed was not a structure. What was destroyed was the assumption that made the structure meaningful. I will be tracking the Russian response in the days ahead because the response itself will reveal even more about what remains of the strategic command architecture and what does not. There are operations I expect to see in the next 72 hours that will confirm or refine this assessment, and there are diplomatic signals from the Kremlin that will tell us whether the regime has accepted the new reality or is still in denial about it. If you want to follow this analysis as the next phase unfolds, and the next phase will unfold quickly, subscribe to the channel. We are building toward a community of viewers who understand modern warfare at a level the casual news cycle will never reach, and every subscription helps us continue producing this kind of strategic analysis. Help us reach the next milestone, because the next milestone is what allows us to expand the research, deepen the sourcing, and bring you more of the doctrinal analysis that is impossible to find anywhere else. Stay with me, because the questions ahead do not have simple answers. What does a great power do when its strategic command architecture has been broken and it cannot afford to rebuild it? How does an authoritarian regime explain to its own military elite that the sanctuary doctrine is dead? And what does the rest of the world learn from watching a nuclear-armed empire lose the protection of its own interior to an opponent the empire dismissed 3 years ago as marginal? Those are the questions that will define the next chapter. I will answer them in the days ahead. Until then, remember the doctrinal truth that this strike confirms. In modern warfare, the side that protects its assumptions loses to the side that destroys them. Russia protected its assumptions. Ukraine destroyed them. And what cannot be rebuilt is not the command center. What cannot be rebuilt is the world in which that command center mattered.